Hi everyone, welcome to Yara's Spring Nutrition Strategy webinar, the first one of the year. I'm Natalie Wood, the Agronomy Operations Manager, and I'm just going to go through some of these topics today. So a bit on the economics in terms of how they're differing now, what the excess winter rainfall means and how waterlogging will have affected crops, and how we can use nutrition to combat some of those impacts of winter weather. What we've learned from foliar N, because that's still, we still get questioned quite a lot on that. Micronutrients, a bit on emissions, and then just a little bit on some of our digital tools as well. Okay, so if we start off by kind of looking at the economics of winter wheat, spring barley here in comparison to the fertilizer, we can see that, economics are still very good. We've got the margin over nitrogen cost there, looking pretty good despite the changes in price over the last few years. You can see as well the economic optimum N rate hasn't changed too much if we look at 21 versus 22, and similarly with spring barley as well. And I guess where we do see slight drop is the return pound for pound spent. So that's the green bar here at the bottom. And you can see, yes, of course, that has dropped somewhat, but they are still, still good returns. But, the risk that's associated with it is, higher because of the prices as they are, but, still very good returns on investment. So if we look at some of the possible issues that we've had that have been weather related over autumn kind of winter period. If we look back at autumn, then we had a very warm and very wet autumn, in particular the month of November. So you can see here the percentage increases of the amount of rainfall we've had there. So, 23% more, 13, 19, 34% in Northern Ireland there extra. So, we have had very wet weather. And you can see as well the temperature changes are also, increased compared to normal. So, these aren't particularly helpful conditions when we're looking at the crop going over the winter. How has this affected crops? Well, because of that extra rainfall, we know that the nutrients can be lost through the soil profile, and that means that the nutrient availability is likely to be low just because the pure amount of rain that we've had go through that soil system. But we also know that waterlogging causes issues with root systems. And if we look at this little graphic here, what we've got is the adventitious roots that are the ones at the top there, and then you've got the seminal roots, which are the ones further down. When we get a lot of waterlogging, what we tend to see is these seminal roots die back, and what you're left with is the adventitious roots that are at the top there. As the crop kind of starts to regenerate after the waterlogging, what you end up with is more of these adventitious roots being put out because you've lost that mass below. But the issue that we've got there obviously is the fact that they are relatively shallow compared to those seminal roots, which are the ones that can really grow down and access all the water and the nutrients, etc. So, you're left with a shallow root system effectively. So, that's going to scupper the uptake of nutrients, but as well, if we think a bit further ahead, if we're going into kind of a dry spring, then again, we've got just this shallow root system to cope with any drought conditions where ideally you want these lower down roots to get to the water if that is the case and we have another dry spring. So yeah, as you can see there, it also affects tillering capacity, so that does decrease as well. So it's kind of a double whammy there. And looking at these graphs, sorry, there's a lot on there, but if we look at this top line here with the open circles, that's where we've had some waterlogging to start off with, but then the water has receded and you can see that the number of tillers per plant has recovered. Some of these other options here is where we've had continued waterlogging, drying out, waterlogging, etc. And you can see as the amount of waterlogging occasions increases, we've got less tillers being recovered after a certain amount. So yeah, just something to take into account if you have had an extended period of waterlogging. And you can see here the number of adventitious roots, which are those shallow ones there, also is affected by that waterlogging length. So what we might see then is good above ground growth, but we haven't necessarily got that root system to back it up. Hence why, if crops are looking good, temperatures, we have seen soil temperatures at 5 degrees and air temperatures have been 1.4 degrees above normal. I know we've just had a cold snap, but crops do start to grow at 5 degrees, so we could start to see growth, but we haven't got that root system to kind of back up that above ground growth that we've got there. Because of those conditions, crops are likely to reach T0 pretty quickly. But what they are likely to do is stay there for that extended period of time, because the switch is actually to do with day length. So, it's going to end up staying at that T0 position because it's reached it quickly, but we haven't yet reached that third week of March where it kind of starts to switch its growth stage. So, we'll start to see an extended period really at that T0 section. How do we then use nutrition to help repair the root system? Well, a good starting point is nitrates. So we know that nitrates are immediately available, and you can see from these diagrams here, we've got the nitrate there and the ammonium there. So the nitrate has created a much bigger root system when you compare it to the ammonium. So that's because, it's immediately available. And we've got that bigger root system. With a bigger root system, obviously, you've got much more capacity to access nutrients, etc., and feed in the crop. And again, you can see here with the actual pictures, the difference there in root systems between the nitrate and the ammonium there. However, it's not all bad. Under some conditions, you can recover from prolonged waterlogging. And you can see there that's 42 to 80 days, so quite an extended period there of waterlogging. Yet we can still achieve those yields of nearly up to 100%. So it's not all bad. But how do you know if it's affecting your crop? The only way you're going to know that is by getting the spade and digging up some plants of your own to check. Just check that you're looking for those fresh white root tips, really. If you've got those, the ends of those roots are quite healthy and are able to then obviously grow. If you've lost that growing point and you haven't got the fresh white tips, that's where you might be at risk of having to rely just on that shallow root system. And yet we've got to use appropriate nutrition and we can help those crops recover. How do we do that? Well, it's a combination really. Early N rates that are right for that crop and situation, as well as some of the other nutrients that I'll go into in a while. So if we start with early nitrogen, particularly looking at rate and timing and how we can kind of influence the various parts of the plant. Here we've got how the rate of nitrogen kind of affects tillers per plant. So obviously, as the more nitrogen or the higher nitrogen rate you've got, the more tillers you're going to get. On this one, it's looking at the timing, so how the timing affects the tillers per meter squared. So you can see there we've got 3 different timings and you can see the various splits. And you can see that where we've had a 70 or 100 at that first early timing, we've got much higher numbers of tillers per meter squared there compared to the lower rate of 40 at that first timing. And then we can take that right through to ears per meter squared as well. So you can see at the 2 differing seed rates, the higher rates of nitrogen again have produced much more ears per meter squared there. So, what we're doing now is effectively going right through to that ears per meter squared, so that this first nitrogen timing really is vital. So when we think about kind of rates that we want to go with, we need to replace what's been lost from that excess rainfall, and also we need to compensate for that shallow root system. So really we want a minimum first nitrogen rate of 70 kilos per hectare of nitrogen, and that's in that mid to late February timing, obviously with weather conditions permitting. What we can then do is adjust that second application rate depending on the weather. We've had a lot of dry springs in the past 10 years. I think 8 out of 10 years has been a dry spring. So if that is the case, we can hold back a little bit on that second application. and either wait and put it into the third application, or split that second application into two smaller applications if that's the case, say 40 followed by 40, for example. And this was a trial that we did last year looking at rate and timing. So you can see, because we had a dry spring last year, the winning treatment was the one that put on 60 to begin with, 40 followed by the larger dose at the last timing of 80. So because that's a dry spring, that was the good strategy that works that year. You know, in a different year, you would probably be better off looking at this particular split, but you know, it really depends on the weather and the year. So you know, that's why we need to be dynamic enough to change our strategy, you know, as the weather denotes, really. This is the end response that we had this year. So as you can see there, a typical end response curve, as you'd expect, as the rates of nitrogen increase up to a certain level, we get an increase, and then obviously as you start to put on too much nitrogen, you're getting a drop off there. But that's, you know, that's a classical end response curve there. And you can see as well, this was a very fertile soil, so we're getting over 9 tons per hectare from that untreated yield. But you can see, you know, we've still got a really good response, and we can get up to that 12.3, as you can see there, 12.2. And the proteins at this site as well followed that classical linear response. So as the amount of nitrogen increases, so does the protein in the grain. If you look at our long-term data, so you can see this particular set's from 2006 to 2021, and you can see why we're showing this really is to show that first 100 kilograms, the first red arrow there, has the best response. So you're getting the highest increase in yield and the best kilograms of grain per kilogram of nitrogen from that first 100 kilos. The next 60 kilos, you're still getting, you know, a decent increase in yield there, 0.77 tons per hectare, but you can see your kilogram of grain per kilo of nitrogen has dropped. And this is just how the efficiency differs as you start to go up that curve. And this last one's circled. Ordinarily, you know, when prices were back down to more normal rates, that last kind of application, you know, you wouldn't bat an eyelid at. You're getting a 0.38 ton per hectare yield increase and 6 kilos of grain per kilogram of N for that last little push. Obviously now with economics as they are, we probably aren't going to be pushing up to that 220 rate. So yeah, it's just thinking about whether it's worthwhile for you, whether what price you've bought at, what you've sold at, etc., as to where you'll be within this 160 to 220, and whether you want to push for that extra yield. Obviously, there is still a return, but it's more of a risk, I guess. So yeah, it's not just nitrogen that's important. We know that phosphate is very important for root growth in particular. And from this graph, we can see that soil phosphate isn't really available until you start to get up to soil temperatures of 9-10 degrees and above. If at the moment, say we're down at 5 or 6, you know, we're about 10-12% relative availability there, so really low amounts of availability at this time of year. That's why really an application of fresh phosphate in the spring is a great idea, because it's immediately available and it's going to help that struggling root system as well, try and get the most out of those roots that we're trying to grow, to try and back up what we might have lost with the waterlogging. Foliar phosphate is another way of getting kind of phosphate into the crop. Obviously it's going through the leaf, so it is very efficient. Obviously we can't apply enough through the leaf to fulfill the crop demand, so therefore this is kind of in addition to your solid P or your soil phosphate. But these applications are interlinked really, so that NPKS application, if you are going with that, follow it within 7 to 10 days with a foliar phosphate application, or as close as possible really, because what you're going to do with the foliar phosphate, it's going to get into the plant much quicker. You'll spark that growth. And what you don't want to do is then for it to start growing, run out of steam because it hasn't got the NPKS to back it up. So they very much need to be on at a similar time if you're going to go down that route. And here's just an example. So we've got 52S there. You can see the analysis followed by maize boost. So that's got PK, zinc and magnesium in there. Sulfur is also obviously a very key nutrient, and it's particularly important with nitrogen uptake and utilization. So of course, with that comes an increase in nitrogen use efficiency as well. We've had trials in the past that show responses of up to 1.4 tonnes per hectare, but really on average we see kind of 8.85 tonnes per hectare for wheat and half a tonne a hectare for oilseed with the sulfur application. And this was a trial that we had this year, looking at extran versus axan. So extran is straight nitrogen, axan is sulfur product. And then we've got urea plus an inhibitor and amidase plus an inhibitor. So amidase is urea plus sulfur. So you can see in both cases there we've got an increase for using that sulfur containing product in wheat, and then also in oilseed, again we've got that increase from the straight nitrogen through to the NS product there. If we think of micronutrients, obviously we've spoken about the maize boost. Good timing for that is at T0. You've got your P, K, zinc and mag from there. And we need to kind of utilize these micronutrients to manipulate the aspects that I showed in the graphs earlier. So ears, number of ears, grain per ear, etc. And zinc and manganese in particular are important for that. If we look at these two graphs, you can see we've increased the number of spikes per meter squared with both manganese and zinc there. And again, the number of grains per spike has been significantly increased there with the addition of manganese or zinc. So yeah, certainly something to think about, and particularly at these early timings, where we can get these onto the crop nice and early. If we're thinking about a little bit ahead and into T1, then Gramitrel will fit that nicely. Again, we're looking at that zinc, manganese, magnesium and copper. We have done trials on Gramitrel for quite a long time. And we can see here when we've used it in combination with maize boost, which was at the T0, and then Gramitrel at T1, you can see here we've got a 0.6 tonnes per hectare increase from that combination of the maize boost followed by the Gramitrel there. So certainly something to consider for the spring. Boron as well. We've had a wet year, obviously, so boron is more likely to be deficient. It's really important for pollination, grain set, lots of things within the crop, key in oilseed as well as cereals. And we can see here this is a site in winter wheat that we had looking at bore track at different timings. And when used at 2 timings as a split, you can see there we've got a really good yield increase compared to the control there. So certainly something to consider. Don't forget, people often mention boron toxicity, but there's very little risk, if not any risk, when you're using grams per litre. Our products are applying literally grams per litre to get these kind of responses. You'd need to be applying kind of kilograms to get boron toxicity in wheat, so not something to worry about. If we go on to a bit about ammonia emissions, urea has the highest ammonia emissions, there's no getting around that. There are nitrogen losses obviously associated with urea via that ammonia volatilization. It can occur in any month, but February, March, if the conditions are conducive for it, we will see volatilization in those months. And of course, most urea users will use it at that early timing for agronomic reasons. But if we're thinking about environmental reasons, then yeah, it's very much the months where we can see volatilization if you've got kind of a drying wind, moist soils, relatively warm air temperatures. If we think back to February a few years ago, we had 18-20 degrees in the end of February, so it's not unheard of to have those kind of conditions. So if you are using urea, and obviously there's a lot of urea in the country this year, you just need to manage it, I guess, to make sure that you're minimizing the risk as much as possible. Some of you perhaps haven't used urea for quite a long time, so you just need to take those kind of things into consideration when you're using that product. If we look at the emissions with inhibitor, as I say, they can be high in February and March. soil temperature, moisture. We've got a very small crop canopy at that time of year as well, so there's lots of bare soil, which is where the volatilization can occur. Agronomically, if we are managing the ammonia loss, then ideally we should inhibit all urea/UAN applications. But the rules will be that after the 1st of April, you will need an inhibitor. But as we've shown, earlier applications could still require an inhibitor. And if you want to minimize any losses, then definitely an inhibitor would be the way to go. If we look at this on the right-hand side, you can see urea there. And what we're looking at is this one at the bottom. This is the mean of all those sites. So that's 24, emission factor of 24 there for urea. AN down at 3. Obviously that doesn't have a urease inhibitor because there's no need for one. And then if we look at this green here, which is the urea plus agrotane, which is an inhibitor, you can see it has brought it down significantly from 24 to 6, but it's still double the amount of emissions that you'd have with just ammonium nitrate. So just something to consider as we go forward. Environmental factors are only going to be more on the agenda. So certainly using a urease inhibitor if you are applying urea is good, but you're still going to get double the emissions of the AN there. Again, with the yield advantage, from the work that we've done, it's kind of unpredictable. So you're not able to rely upon getting any kind of yield advantage. So at the moment, looking at this, it is purely kind of a environmental kind of aspect. So in terms of managing out the risk, we want to minimize losses. So think about your nitrogen source, think about the rate and the timing of that nitrogen that you're applying. Manage any expected deficiencies. We know that we have deficiencies each year. Manganese, boron particularly, copper and zinc, and even magnesium. We see those coming through the labs every year as deficient in a lot of the samples. Use tried and tested products. If we are trying to minimize risk, experimenting is probably not the best idea at the moment with pricing as it is. So if that's different ways of putting sulfur on, biostimulants, biologicals, etc. I'm not saying don't use them, but maybe just on a smaller scale to test them, see whether they work for you or not. And then use weather data to mitigate any risks as well for helping with planning. So as I mentioned, if you think it's going to be a dry spring, you can alter your strategy accordingly. A quick note then on Atfarm. Utilizing kind of the digital tools that you've got on offer can really help increase that nitrogen use efficiency. Anything that's going to help you put on the right amount of nitrogen and also at the right time is going to help increase. The N tester, which is what we've got a picture of there, that tells you the level of nitrogen in the crop, so that can help make you an informed decision about the rate and timing of the nitrogen. And we've got the VRA there, so that's variable rate applications. And because this can be done through Atfarm, as we can see on the screen there, but also through our N sensor as well. And we can see yield increases of up to 4% by increasing that homogeny of the crop. So ideally what you're trying to create is a nice even homogeneous crop, less lodging. It's going to be much easier to harvest, and with that comes the yield increase there. There is an offer on as well at the moment with Atfarm, so it is free. If you want to register, just go to atfarm.com and you'll find the registration page, log in, and you can actually receive a free N tester as well as have free access to the variable rate applications. Just to summarize then, the economic returns are still good, but we do need to manage them correctly to make sure they're maintained. Be flexible and dynamic with any of your management decisions. Obviously, there's different parameters for each farm, so it's going to be treated differently, and there's no one size fits all, so it needs to work for you. High nitrogen use efficiency is a good thing, but if you're talking about foliar nitrogen, for example, that can come with a very high nitrogen use efficiency, it doesn't always equate to the best margin, so just bear that in mind. And make sure that you use any of these tools that are freely available to help inform decisions. It's free at the moment, so please take advantage of it. And yes, we know if less fertilizer is used, then we are going to have less product overall. So again, just something to bear in mind there. And there we have one basis point as well available for watching this webinar. So thank you for your attention, and please do follow us on social media, so Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. And as I say, if you want to sign up for the Atfarm offer, then just go to atfarm.com and register your details there. Thank you.